Good day and welcome to my first ever live stream. Well, at least live stream on my own. I have done some in the past with some other people. Anyway, the reason I've done this live stream is to give you the opportunity to ask questions if there are anybody watching, and to kind of understand where I'm coming from and why I'd have my channel SCO BRICS Insight. Although I'd say it's SCO BRICS Insight, it's mainly about Russia and Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and Central Asia, and Russia's relationship with them. That's mainly because I've been involved with Russia for around 35 years, actually, or 34. And the reason for that is I first came to Russia in 1991 in February, and for a look, actually, to see what it was like, and the whole end of the communism, fall of the Soviet Union. It was pretty much happening. And I came and basically decided that I quite liked the place, and it was pretty much happening. We're talking about the end of 78 years of communist rule. And the whole world was changing. Eastern Europe had changed and Russia was about to change. And I found it fascinating. Now, Russia is obviously the largest country in the world, and it's pretty much misunderstood. I mean, during the 90s, under Yeltsin, it was very much welcomed back into the Western fold, the end of communism, the end of the Cold War, etc. And Russia tried really hard to sort of become European. I mean, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin took over from Mikhail Gorbachev, who was assured back then by the Americans, George Bush Sr. and his chums, that if he allowed the reunification of Germany, NATO would not move 1 inch eastwards. So, of course, we know that was a complete lie, and which is why we're at the situation that we have within the Ukraine. Anyway, one of the reasons I'm doing this, and I want to explain to you, is the fact that the problem I have is I'm a Brit living in Russia, and I've lived here a long time, but I can see Russia from the perspective British, as well as from our European, and as well as from a Russian perspective. Whereas the media represents Russia in a completely wrong, in my opinion, way, and never ever is accurate or fair. I mean, in the 1990s, Russia was actually celebrated because of the end of communism. But what happened when communism ended and the country basically fell apart? I mean, what we're looking at is something that made the 1930s in America and in Europe with the Great Depression look like a Sunday school picnic. I mean, you're looking at the whole fabric of society that was basically run and owned by the government, if you like, under the communist system, suddenly was dismantled. I mean, everything that people had. I mean, you went to work, you worked in a factory, the factory was owned by the state, you got paid at the end of every month, whether you worked or not. That's what one of the old jokes used to be, was they pay us to pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us with money that we can't buy anything with. So Russia in the 1990s was an interesting place as the economy absolutely collapsed. I mean, life expectancy amongst adult males dropped to the lower 60s, and with women around the late 60s, etc. As major industries, in fact, the major fabric industries of it, the industries, etc., went. I mean, one of the biggest that went actually was the aviation industry. In the time of the Soviet Union, the aviation industry was pretty strong. Russia made its own airliners from scratch. I mean, basically every single component. Now, by the end of the 1990s, Russia didn't have an aviation industry left. And it's only in the 21st century, that particularly the latter part of the 2010s, that it's actually really got back into doing that. But anyway, about Russia in the 1990s, I mean, it was basically a little bit of a Klondike. I mean, the Western banksters, the Chicago mob, and Jeffrey Sachs and his people, they came in and they wanted to turn Russia into a capitalist society overnight, but without the capital. So basically, you had industries that were privatized uh, and basically taken over by a number of oligarchs, billionaires, very much similar to the robber barons, if you like, of the 19th century in the US. You had the Carnegies, the Gettys, and all the others that took over in the United States and became billionaires. Well, you had these were basically people like Berezovsky, Potanin, Abramovich, etc. But Russia did start to develop, but it was slow and it was tough simply because they didn't have any kind of a real sort of function. I mean, you didn't have, for example, the stock market was fledgling, but you had MISEX, which was the Moscow Interbank Currency Exchange, and you also had the Moscow Stock Exchange, and they both were trying to do similar functions. And you had companies trying to list, but there wasn't the capital markets there to actually do it. I mean, I set up a company in 1993 called Russisky Financial Novosti, or Russia Financial News, to cover what was happening in the fledgling financial markets. And the banks had come in, etc. But, that was undercapitalized. And basically, they were doing was they weren't doing IPOs. They were basically bankrolling companies like Norilsk Nickel or UCOS, etc. Uh, to buy up the companies for pennies on the dollar and making lots of money while the ordinary people didn't make anything. Plus, they didn't pay any taxes. So the government was actually getting no money whatsoever. So consequently, the budget was constantly borrowing. Now, things came to a head back in 1997. And that was when Boris Yeltsin had actually got re-elected. And that was a farce as well. I mean, basically from it was they bought it. I mean, like, President Clinton was the president in the US, and he spent $2 billion getting Yeltsin elected because Zyuganov, who was the head of the Communist Party, was leading in all the polls. And basically, they didn't want communism to come back, or at least a communist party to take over in Russia, as they felt that they had control. And of course, at the time, the Western banks and the oligarchs did have control. So they spent $2 billion. And if you don't believe me, look up a front cover of Time magazine from 1996 called The Yanks to the Rescue, which actually documents the fact that the election was stolen. So it's not just in America that they steal elections. They've been stealing them all over the world for a long time. Anyway, so the 1990s was pretty hideous, but I kind of enjoyed it because it was things were happening and I could see a rebirth of the country. I mean, one of the most wonderful things is of it is the character of the people. Now, that was the thing that fascinated me the most. I met wonderful, warm, clever, intelligent people, and that made me fall in love with the country. Plus, it's got a fantastic history and a huge amount of culture. I mean, the music, the theaters, the ballet, the opera, etc. I love it and whatever. So the 1990s was pretty grim for your average Russian. Well, apart from Berezovsky, Abramovich, Potanin, and a few others. But things did come to a head in 1998. And boy, was that something else. I mean, basically what had been happening is the Russian government had been borrowing money on a monthly basis to finance its spending. And it was issuing bonds every month at 30% interest and only paying enough every month to pay off the previous year's 1 month borrowing. So it got to the point where it just wasn't sustainable. So they defaulted on their foreign debt and their domestic debt. And of course, the whole thing had been a house of cards. Most of the banks in Russia, the fledgling ones, and many of the Western banks had bought up what they were known as Russian government bonds called GKOs. And of course, they went bankrupt. I mean, most of the banks evaporated, and the Western banks who'd invested heavily took a serious hit for, so about, I think it was about 17 to 18 billion dollars, which doesn't sound a lot now, but back then it was a huge amount. I mean, Russia's foreign exchange reserves at the time was only about 15 billion. And of course, another thing to understand back then was the oil price. I mean, Russia was still a major oil producer as well as gas. It was supplying gas to Europe, which it had been doing since the 1960s. But the oil price was only $13 to $14 a barrel. So it wasn't actually making any money. And the oil companies didn't actually pay any taxes anyway, which is what happened to UCOS back in 2003. But that's another story that we'll go into. Anyway, things in Russia really did start to change when Yeltsin finally had realized that he was not any good for Russia and that Russia needed serious change. And that's when he handed over in the November of 1999 to Vladimir Putin. Now, Vladimir Putin basically became prime minister. And at the turn of the century into the 2000s, Russia was a basket case. I mean, I'm talking a serious basket case. I mean, economically and in every single way. The people were without hope, they were bereft. I mean, most of them were just above starvation. I mean, you have to remember, many of them had been working for state-owned companies and partially state-owned companies, and many of them hadn't been paid for months on end. Well, when Putin came to power, one of the first things he vowed was the pensioners and the workers would start to get their salaries paid. And he did a crackdown. And he basically got the oligarchs around the table in the first 6 or 7 months and said, right, you're not controlling this anymore. I'm in charge and the government's in charge, and we're going to turn this situation around for the benefit of the people. So everybody who thinks that what they think about Putin now, he's a dictator, he's been in power 25 years. Putin inherited a complete economic basket case in turn of 1999-2000, and he's turned it around by 2025 into the 4th largest economy by purchasing power parity in the world, right? Now, if you've watched any of my videos, you can see I cover a lot of things from agriculture to industry to whatever. And all of these things have happened since then. I mean, the first couple of years were actually tough, but he gradually got things going. People like Berezovsky, they were exiled because he wouldn't accept the fact that he was not the kingmaker anymore and he was not in power. He went off to London where, as we all know, he had a major spat with Abramovich, and then he committed suicide, we understand, because he'd run out of money, having spent around 2 billion of his ill-gotten gains that he managed to get out. So anyway, by 2003, let's not forget, 2003, Putin was actually a darling of the West. They thought he was a man they could do business with and they would enjoy and love. In fact, he came to the UK on a state visit. He stayed at Buckingham Palace and he met the Queen. And, that was Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was a guest at Buckingham Palace on a full state visit in 2003. Of course, things started to change not long after that, simply because we had the outbreak of the Iraq War. Well, it wasn't an outbreak of a war, it was an American invasion with Tony Blair and George Bush deciding that they wanted rid of a number of people. And the first person on the list was Saddam Hussein with the cooked up weapons of mass destruction. Now, Russia opposed that, but they weren't actually in a position at the time to do anything about it. But they stood back on the sidelines and hummed and hawed. And of course, this was the point where it was NATO was heavily involved. Now, NATO at that point should have actually no longer been in existence because, let's be honest, it should have actually gone back in 1992 when the Warsaw Pact went So you had the Warsaw Pact which was the quick rival, and of course NATO stayed around, and of course we know that from 1990 as in the Balkans and what they did in Serbia in 1999 when they bombed it for 90 or 78 days. Anyway, so Russia has changed dramatically, and I'll try and cover some of that in this program. I'm going to do about 35 minutes just for a start, because I want to give you a taste of this, because I'd like to try and do this on a regular basis, and I'd like you all to give me questions and whatever. So I just want to cover why I love Russia and how I know so much about it, because I've lived here and I've worked as a journalist and whatever. Anyway, so as I said, Putin went to London. He was in the UK. He was a guest at Buckingham Palace, a state visit. But that's after the Iraq War, things started to change. And of course, that was the point where they decided that they were going to expand NATO even further into some of the former Soviet republics. Now, we're talking particularly the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I mean, Poland had already become a member, as had the Czechoslovakia before it became the Czech Republic. And other countries had become members of the European Union or were looking to do so. So this is how it all kind of happened. But then we could see this was all going to happen. And the relationship between Russia and the West kind of moved by sort of 2007. Vladimir Putin had seen the writing on the wall as far as NATO and George Bush, etc., was concerned. So he stood up at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 and basically sort of said, stop, no further expansion into our spheres of orbit, right? Enough is enough. But he was ignored. I mean, basically, that was at the point where they were talking about firstly, the Ukraine, and then we were talking about Georgia. Now, going back to a couple of years before the 2007, you had in 2005 the disputed elections in the Ukraine, which was the first orange kind of revolution, as you have it. And then, of course, you had the Rose Revolution that took place in Georgia. So these were things, and they were obviously all financed by US aid and the various so-called charities, Uncle George, as they used to call him, from the Open Society Foundation of Soros, etc. So basically, that was the start of where the conflict was going to happen. Now, in 2008, after the 2007 Security Conference, Saakashvili in Georgia, at the behest of NATO and he thought with the American backing, while Putin was off in Beijing for the Beijing Olympics, decided to invade South Ossetia to test how Russia would react. Well, Russia's resolve was there, and it went in 5 days. They slapped the Georgians around and pushed them out again. And for those of you who haven't read it, there was a report by the EU that blamed Georgia for the conflict there, and it wasn't a Russian invasion. Now, this was the point where Ukraine started to become difficult, and the governments in the Ukraine used to flip between the Russian ethnic groups of Yanukovych and also then with Kuchma, etc. So it all became a little bit of kind of crazy. But that was the point where Ukraine, you have to remember, Ukraine was in 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was actually the richest of the Soviet republics, apart from Russia. It was also on par with Poland. If you look at it now, it will take 100 years of extreme growth for the Ukraine to become anywhere near Poland, simply because of what's happened with Poland since 1991. And all that's happened in the Ukraine is everything of any serious value has been stripped, has been taken by the oligarchs and then sold off. I mean, it's whole industries. I mean, its steel industry was still pretty large, but it was hadn't been invested in and hadn't been working at proper levels for many years, as was its coal industry, its shipbuilding, motor sets, its engine factories, its aircraft factories, etc. None of that was working. So all of that kind of happened. So what we're talking about is the fact that there was a build up towards 2014, and that was coming. We could tell that that was coming simply because the pressure was building on NATO expansion. They'd already got the Baltic states involved. They had Romania, they had Bulgaria, and the last pieces of the jigsaw would certainly be Georgia and the Ukraine, and particularly the Ukraine, because the big prize, of course, was the Black Sea port of Sevastopol. Now, obviously, Sevastopol and Crimea at the time were part of the Ukraine, but Russia had a lease for 40 years on the base. And if NATO was able to take that, if Ukraine became a partner of or part of NATO, then of course it would become a NATO base and Russia would be pushed out of its only major naval base in the Black Sea. And we'd have to build another one that would be pretty difficult. I mean, there's Novosibirsk, which is mainly an oil port, but it certainly wouldn't replace something that had been part of Russia since 1792. Anyway, in the meantime, before we go into 2014 Maidan, Crimea, etc., Russia had started and embarked on a major economic development. I mean, you have to remember that in 2000, Russia was importing grain from America and Canada. It imported 20 million tons just to feed the people. Right? By 2025, Russia was producing 125 million tons of grain and exporting 60 million tons. And Russia's actually the largest grain exporter on the planet. Now, also, it had expanded into many, many other areas of development of its industries with capital development to redo all of the things that were lost. I mean, Russia had become a major hydrocarbons supplier to Europe, and in return, it would buy German and Austrian equipment, engineering, etc., which was quite a fair price, but it was basically neglecting its own industrial base. It was producing steel, it was producing aluminium, it was producing nickel, and semi-finished goods, etc., but it had neglected all of that. Now, by 2014, after the Maidan coup, Russia embarked on a major, what was known as import substitution, and that came from across the board. Right? It went from the agricultural sector to engineering and to all sorts of particular areas to reduce the dependency on the West and only work with what was known as friendly countries. Now, this is just 11 years ago. So Russia actually realized back then that things were actually going to escalate and had made plans to do various things about it. And it had done. So the government planned, a bit like those 5-year plans that used to not work back in Soviet time, to actually develop industries and develop them around their cities. I mean, the city that I live in, Ufa, I mean, we have the Europe's largest oil refinery, also 2 major petrochemical plants, which produce a wide variety of chemicals and plastics and polymers, etc., that go exported all around the world, particularly mainly to Asia, Central Asia, Southern Asia, and to China. Now, it's petroleum products. Russia has a wide overcapacity of its petrol. It used to sell it all to Turkey and to Europe, but now, of course, it sells it to Turkey, it sells it to the Middle East, and they then sell it to Europe because they don't want it anymore. And as far as this whole Russia as a gas station masquerading as a country, this could be further from the truth. Russia is self-sufficient in energy, and it's also self-sufficient in food production. I mean, recently, I mean, it's quite interesting. Just watch some of my old videos. It's Russia now produces tomatoes and cucumbers in greenhouses in the Krasnoyarsk region. Uh, and it's almost self-sufficient in tomato production. Where it used to buy its tomatoes from Germany, from Spain, and its pork from Germany. I mean, it's meat production. Russia is now a major pig producer and pork producer, and it sells a lot to China. I mean, it sells something like 500,000 tons of pigs produce to China. And that's a lot of pigs. And of course, the one thing about the Chinese is they take it all. I mean, the only thing with four legs that the Chinese don't eat is a table, and the only thing with wings they don't eat is an airplane. So they eat the heads, the tails, the chickens, the feet, etc. So Russia sells a lot of that. So Russia's also self-sufficient in chicken. Chicken meat, it also sells a fair bit now to the Middle East. I mean, it's also taken over as the major supplier of grains and wheat to North Africa, Central Africa, and into Asia. So, I mean, it's not just oil and gas, it's foodstuffs. Russia also sells a lot of petrochemicals. It also sells a lot of aluminium, nickel. One of the other things that's quite interesting, because I do a fair bit of this, is gold. Russia is the world's second largest gold producer. It actually produces around 330 tons per annum, and that's just behind the Chinese. And with the opening of the new Sukhoi log mine, it will probably move up to 400 tons into there. Now, bear in mind that each ton of gold is worth about $100 million. That's a lot of gold to be producing on an annual basis. So also Russia's manufacturing sector. I mean, it's quite interesting that Russia now makes consumer goods. I mean, before Russia imported everything from Asia, the same as the West did. But now you have Russian brands of household appliances, washing machines, refrigerators, and other household appliances. They've all happened because they've reindustrialized the whole country. I mean, it's now working on, and it will have by the end of this year, the MS-21 aircraft, which is a completely built in Russia, manufactured in Russia, its systems and all its components, airliner. And even Boeing and Airbus can't boast that. So that's really some of the things that are happening. So it's an exciting place to live, and none of what you hear about in the Western press is accurate. It's absolute, complete nonsense. I mean, if I had $1 for every time that a Western journalist had told me that the Russian economy is going to crash, I would be very, very rich. Yes, interest rates are currently 16.5%, but that doesn't affect your average Russian, because the only thing they have is a car loan or they have a mortgage. Now, bear in mind, your average Briton or your French or your American pays 18 and 19 and 20% on their credit cards. So it's hardly fatal, is it? Right? Plus inflation they talk about. Well, inflation's currently in Russia about 8%. But whereas the inflation in the West is normally counted by things that don't actually matter, here it's food, energy costs are minimal levels of inflation because they're regulated by the government. So your average grandmother or your average family have no problems. They don't have to decide in the winter whether to eat or heat. They can do both. Plus, of course, everybody's got a dacha. At least 60%, I think, is the population have access to a dacha. We certainly have, because we grow a wide variety of stuff there. And it's all what you would call in the West organic. And it's great stuff. We grow everything from tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, to potatoes, to carrots, to garlic, to herbs, to all sorts of stuff. We even grow fruit, apples, we grow grapes, we grow apricots, and all sorts of stuff. So it's all about kind of fun. And that sees us through the winter. And of course, that helped everybody back in the 90s to feed. Now, in my monologues, as I do on a regular basis, I tend to look at different sectors of the industry or different particular points about, or certainly things within Russia. And I want to have your feedback because that will help me choose of what sort of subjects that you want to know about. I mean, I read the Western press, so I try and do sort of programs or videos that tell the truth about what's happening in particular areas, particularly in Russia, but also in places like Finland and the Balkans, the Baltic states. I mean, the Baltic states, for example, all three of them have lost about 1/3 of their population since they stopped being part of the Soviet Union and started being part of the EU. And that's mainly because the young people have left because there's nothing left. I mean, they've got no serious industries to talk about. In Finland, I've made a couple of videos recently, but that's again, it's a country that's now become a basket case because it gave up its neutrality and decided that it wanted to be part of NATO. Why? When Russia's never going to be a threat to them. In fact, it was their economic prosperity was based on the fact that they were part of Russia, a partner of Russia. Sorry. And the same with the Baltics. I mean, they keep screaming Russia's going to attack us. Russia has no interest in them whatsoever. I can assure you, that nobody is interested in invading Riga or Vilnius at all. So, and certainly they're not interested in invading Helsinki. They don't mind going there for a visit. But as I did a program the other week, that things are too expensive in Helsinki and they're not a lot of fun. So I think it's actually going to be unlikely. Now, I'm going to sort of stop this in probably the next couple of minutes. So I hope you've enjoyed this kind of monologue. I'm trying to do it off the cuff and just so that you understand a bit about me, who I am, what I've done. I say I live in Ufa, which is a city just above Kazakhstan, midway between Yekaterinburg and Kazan, and just get a better feel of who I am rather than me just telling you bits and pieces of facts, figures, and show you a few pictures. So do please subscribe to the channel. Do keep up the dialogue, and I will do another one of these on a specific subject. And hopefully, in the near future, I'll have some guests on where we can discuss various aspects of everything. Anyway, thanks very much for joining me today. I wish you all well, and please do keep the comments coming. Love to see you all, and thank you very much. Take care.